Hello, everyone out there in podcast land. Welcome back to Adventure Capital, where we not only discuss the entrepreneurial journeys and adventures with founders who have raised capital on WeFunder, but also the different resource providers and mentors helping founders along the way. Huzzah! Today we have Wierson of LEAH Labs, the first company utilizing gene editing to engineer living therapies for dogs. That's humans' best science for humans' best friend. WeFunder gang, take it away.
So Wes, great to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jonny. Good to be here.
Maybe we can get started by you telling us about LEAH Labs. What do you guys do?
So LEAH Labs is a company that was founded to bring really innovative new types of therapies called cell therapies. So we can actually reprogram living cells now and get them to do a therapeutic thing. We founded LEAH Labs really to be the company to be the first one to bring these new types of therapies to dogs to help with different diseases. So our first focus is dogs that have cancer. This is not only because there's a huge unmet need for better therapies for dogs that have cancer, but also because dogs and humans get the same types of diseases. They get the same types of cancers. They have the same genetic drivers. They have the same markers, the same phenotypes, and they're really good models for one another. So not only are we at LEAH Labs looking to do something that's never before been possible, bring cell therapies to dogs to help dogs that have cancer, but we're also really looking to help model diseases and help pharma companies and academics who have novel human cell therapies actually get to market faster by helping dogs and by using dogs as a spontaneous disease model.
Awesome. You said cell therapy for a layman, and bear in mind that the last time I studied biology or chemistry or any science, I was 16 years old. What is different? Or what is kind of oncology? You call it oncology in dogs as well, I guess?
Yeah, for sure.
What does kind of cancer treatment look like for dogs today, and why is cell therapy different and better?
Yeah, for sure. So, just like in humans, cancer in dogs is treated, generally speaking, with chemotherapies. And so, in fact, the first cancer that we're targeting, it's called B-cell lymphoma in dogs. It's a clinical analog of what we call non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in humans. The best treatment right now, as it stands for dogs that have this type of cancer, is the exact same type of cancer that's used in humans. It's called CHOP chemotherapy. It's just a combination treatment protocol of a few different types of chemotherapies. And so that's given to dogs in the same way it's given to humans. However, the molecules are a little bit more toxic in dogs than they are in humans. And so the impact of that treatment in dogs isn't as good as it is in humans. So generally speaking, that's how most cancer is treated in dogs. We take what is known about a human drug and how it works in humans, and we try it for dogs because that's just the way it's always been done. And so really that's sort of actually in one way the way of the model that we're following. These types of cell therapies. So this is a total paradigm shift rather than a chemical that can target any cell indiscriminately that's replicating its DNA. That's generally how chemotherapies work. We actually are able to reprogram cells to specifically target cancer cells only. And that's through antibody regions that bind to specific shapes. So much like we're all familiar with antibodies now because of COVID. The monoclonal, the antibodies that bind to the spike protein that's only found on COVID, right? In the same way, cancers have those same types of molecules. And so in humans, one of them is called CD19. That's what cell therapies target for human cancer. And then the same type of cancer in dogs has CD20 that we target. So really, instead of just using these static compounds that are really indiscriminate, cause a lot of off-target toxicities and cause you, like for humans, right? You lose your hair when you go through chemo. These types of therapies are really specific. So you reprogram living cells to actually go in and find that target and then kill that cell specifically.
Is cell therapy for cancer treatment in humans Are there other companies that are like super far along with that? Or is kind of the stuff that you're doing in dogs kind of almost, kind of pioneering and, ahead of the kind of human cancer treatment pack?
Yeah. So thanks for the call back there. So we actually did come up with this idea because in 2017, there were 2 FDA approvals of this new type of cell therapy called CAR T cell therapy that came on board for humans. And we realized, like I said, that dogs and humans get the same type of cancer. and it's a good model. So we really took, from humans medicine again, this idea of a therapy that works for humans, and decided to be the ones to bring it to dogs. And so we have a couple twists on that, on why we're able to do that. One of them is, the fact that we use gene editing technology to create these cells, and the fact that it's regulated by a different a regulatory body, the USDA, not the FDA. There are a couple of the reasons why we can bring this therapy that's like $400,000 for humans down to dogs for, let's say, $4,000. So yeah.
So does the USDA, I would imagine there's kind of less of a kind of stringent, kind of maybe lengthy kind of approval process, which is maybe partly why you're able to do it cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. So the approval process is a lot shorter. The number of patients that you may need to treat is a lot smaller. There's a couple different regulatory steps that are a little bit different. So you can get a conditional license where you can actually start to sell your product really before a full-scale clinical trial is completed. And this is because we just need better therapies for dogs. And so there's these mechanisms, to get therapies out into the market for sale a little bit earlier, I think, than what is really required in humans.
This is a little abstract and kind of off piece, but I feel like there's been some debate around, vaccine approval for COVID, and it's kind of making people rethink, do we have the right kind of regulatory approach with respect to like the FDA? What do you have a kind of philosophical take on that? Should we be kind of, almost like more experimental, kind of quicker, more agile, and kind of, pushing kind of different approaches out there, or do you feel like we have it pretty right at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a happy medium there. Obviously, the COVID vaccines coming online in 8 months and whatever it was incredible. I mean, well, it was like a couple weeks actually before the first one was proposed, right? In like March 2020. So yeah, of course, that's really awesome, and it just shows you when there is a pressing need like this, what can be done administratively to push forward these new types of therapies. And so certainly, I think that can and should be taken more broadly across new types of therapies outside of vaccines as well. But of course, there is the safety aspect and all the morals and ethics and things like that that we have to keep in mind. But there's definitely a happy medium, and I would think that me personally would like to push things a lot more experimental than we are currently at right now.
When I was at Kiva, which is this crowdfunded microlending nonprofit, was there for 7 years before we fund there. And people would always use this phrase, do no harm. And I really objected to that phrase because the idea in microlending was, do no harm, or we should never make a loan to someone that might over-indebt them, and that might have negative repercussions for them financially. It's like, well, then I can never make a loan to anyone ever. And if we're trying to, innovate and grow and help people, you kind of got to risk like making loans to some people that maybe shouldn't get them. But yeah, I totally agree. Happy medium's the way to go. Where are you guys at right now? What kind of stage of the journey is LEAH at in wrapping up 2021?
Yeah, so we're at a very exciting phase. I'm sure we'll get to our WeFunder rounds, but our second WeFunder round we closed at the end of June this year. We had high hopes that we would actually have our therapy in some dogs by today. Unfortunately, we're missing that mark by a little bit, but we are on the cusp. We're in the paperwork phases of actually getting a clinical trial, our very first clinical trial. We're calling it more of a pilot trial, I guess, for our MVP. Really in biotech, it's not an MVP. It's not a minimal viable product. It's a fully viable product. This is actually what we could end up taking through regulatory, right? It's kind of a different lexicon you have to use in biotech, right?
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's so interesting. You don't iterate on the is it a molecule or I don't know what the noun is, but yeah, you don't iterate on it. It's like, this is the thing. We're not gonna.
Yeah, this is the thing. Certainly we could iterate on a like a protocol, when it's dosed, how much is dosed, something like that. But it has to be, for you to put it into a patient, it has to be a fully viable product. We're not going to take the time, the money, and take someone's dog or human life, right, to just put a minimum viable product into a patient.
Yes.
So anyway, we've built this FVP, if you will, and we're in the paperwork phases of launching our first pilot study. So when all goes well, by March we're going to be treating some patients. So that's where we're at for that. We're really still pushing on different grants as well. So we were funded really early with an NSF, National Science Foundation Phase 1 SBIR. We've now completed that. The objectives of that grant are complete. So we're now in the midst of working on a Phase 2 submission for that. That's $1 million grant with supplements, can be up to like 1.5 million, which is huge. I mean, that's almost the amount of capital that we've raised in dilutive funding from investors. Yeah. So if we could get that grant, that would be awesome. We just recently got another state grant from the Minnesota Economic Development Group, $35,000. And we're pretty hopeful right now, based on some requests for some documents and an email that we just got that here, breaking news, we may have just received an NIH Phase 1 SBIR as well. Beep, 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 beep. Yeah,
newsflash, that's awesome. We are bringing this scoop to the We Found a Podcast audience. You heard it here first, guys. That's really cool, man. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. So anyway, that's where we're at, in the whole journey. When everything goes well here in this next year with our pilot study, raise another round of funding to help us get through the USDA path of approval, and we could still have a product on the market by early, very late 24 or early 25.
Amazing. And how far into the journey are you?
In biotech timeframe, that's unheard of, right? You're looking at 10 years, and for us, that'd be like 4. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, how far into the journey are you? Kind of take us back to the beginning. Why did you start this company? And then, curious on the journey so far.
Yeah, so, as a PhD student, I was studying gene editing tech, so figuring out ways to use CRISPR technology or other types of programmable nucleases that we have, so we can go in to DNA now. Envision DNA as a book or as an essay. You can use your computer mouse. If you have a typo, right, you can go in and you can click on your Word document and fix that typo. So CRISPR, this technology that I was working with as a graduate student, actually is like the cursor. So it's like your mouse. You go in, you find the typo in the DNA or somewhere where you want to click in the essay, and you click there, and then you can direct biological activity to that site. You can direct your keyboard, And so I was working on the keyboard, actually working on adding in new DNA at the site. So actually writing in a new sentence, if you will. And so I developed this technology to add in a new sentence. It seemed to work better than any other tech had ever been developed, at least for zebrafish and some certain cell lines. I think that still sort of stands true in many instances today. It works really, really well to reprogram DNA, certainly in zebrafish. And so, we filed a patent for that technology, started to think about ways to use gene editing in the real world, because gene editing is not a product. You don't sell gene editing, but you use gene editing to create something new, to engineer DNA, right? And so we realized, we could engineer cells to be therapeutic. So started to incubate the idea for LEAH Labs, again, right in coinciding with the 2017 approvals of CAR T-cell therapy for human medicine. So, I was fortunate enough to have some advisors who knew a couple of folks at Y Combinator, just because they're very entrepreneurial and trying to push entrepreneurial, biotech founders, people going from PhD like me to founding a company. And so started having some early conversations with accelerators like that in IndieBio. And, history was changed on November 2nd of 2018. I was still a PhD student, and we got into Y Combinator. And 28 days later, December 1st, whatever the timeline is there, I jumped in full time to LEAH Labs right after I got my PhD. And really after that, I guess kind of the rest is history.
When did you then go through YC? Was that then early 2019?
Yeah. So January 19 into March 2019 was our YC period.
I feel like that's kind of cool in the, I don't know, like all of the kind of personas of YC founders, but I would imagine that kind of PhD student that like hasn't really started the company yet is relatively unusual. I don't know if that's the case, but how did you, like you said, your advisors were kind of pushing you to go for it. What was that process like of, the YC kind of application process and getting in? Were you kind of surprised or,
Yeah, so a couple things, I guess. I would say that it's not unusual, really at all these days now. So Jared Friedman, the partner at YC, who's currently working with the biotech companies, he was just on a podcast recently. I don't remember the name of the podcast, but it was put on by Alix Ventures. And he kind of went through this, and he also put out, a blog post on YC's page about how, technical founders are, the new biotech CEO and founder. And, he kind of outlined, and, this makes total sense, that back when YC was founded, it was really easy in the adoption of the internet era for a technical founder to just get on the internet and start to write, SaaS software.
Right.
And how for biotech, that wasn't the case. For biotech, generally speaking, there were VCs who either created companies or, VCs who went out and funded, the gray-haired CEOs who had been VP, management level at biotech companies who had new ideas.
Yeah.
And a lot of that had to do with the cost of setting up a biotech company, right? The infrastructure needed, recombinant DNA technology was still, relatively in its infancy. And so now, 10 years later, we have CRISPR and, high school students can make CRISPR and edit genes. And, here we are in the era where, in that same way where technical founders used to, YC kind of started the model where technical founders could become the CEO of a company. That's really the model that they're going after now for
really
biotech as well.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So basically,
now
CRISPR,
VCs, I think, are still learning that.
Yeah.
To try to fund those people. Certainly, it's happening though. Yeah.
So CRISPR is kind of one example of a platform, if that's the right word, that's basically lowering the barriers to entry for technical founders to start companies. And so can happen earlier, as you say, is like super common in kind of software. That's really awesome. So what was the Y Combinator experience like? What were the kind of major kind of takeaways from you from those months?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was awesome. Really awesome experience. I would love to know what I know now and then go through YC. I feel like it would be a lot more beneficial. But, I guess, YC funded me to be a first-time founder. So that's exactly how it was supposed to be, I suppose. But what I really took away from it is just the network that comes with being a YC founder. Anything that I have a question about, someone has thought 10,000 hours about, and I can go on their internal platform and ask the question or find someone else who's already asked it. So really the network is, I think, what the biggest thing that came of that for me. They were really early in funding biotech in 2018, 2019. I think it was like 150 or something companies. Now they're up to over 400 or 500, I think. So really starting to ramp up. But, obviously YC is an incredible experience to be around all these really awesome people who have all built companies before and scaled them and had huge exits. And there's a lot to learn from that. So really enjoyed that YC experience.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever chatted to anyone that went through YC that wasn't like, whoa, that was really amazing, which is kind of cool.
It really helps you, even in the biotech, to have to really think about those sprints, right? A 2-week sprint in between, dinner conversations that you would have with your group partners and that kind of thing. Even though it's biotech and the timeline is much longer than a SaaS product, you still should be thinking about things in sprints. And so I've definitely taken that home for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. It's kind of like the MVP doesn't really apply to biotech. Yeah, sprints with like a consumer platform, you can measure the outcome of the sprint in new users signed up in those 2 weeks. That kind of growth those kind of metrics don't really apply to you and biotech founders. But yeah, there are other kind of milestones and markers, I guess, of progress you can demonstrate even in a super short time window. So coming out of YC is when we met and you decided to launch a WeFunder campaign. What was the thinking there? What were your kind of reasons for launching on WeFunder?
Yeah, so honestly, we were funded by YC before we had ran an experiment. We were funded by YC before we incorporated our company. And as a biotech company, it's a lot more challenging, obviously, based on, what we just talked about with sprints, to build a product, to build an MVP. There is, I suppose, an MVP stage is what you do like in vitro, right? In a test tube.
Right.
That's sort of the MVP stage, definitely for
Right.
therapeutics.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to get that, MVP even in 3 months. And so, especially when you hadn't run an experiment. So when we launched and went out on demo day, we didn't have as much to grasp onto and really to fundraise off of for a biotech company to go raise. And the fact of the matter is, we sort of struggled raising, on the YC hype and the YC valuation and that sort of thing. And so, honestly, we turned to WeFunder. In hindsight, it's the perfect platform for LEAH. But we turned to WeFunder almost out of necessity, I guess, at the time, because we didn't want to die. We knew that we had something here. We knew that we had something that should be funded, or should at least have the hypothesis be able to be tested. And I met you, and you really excited me about the idea of, people who are enthusiastic about your mission actually funding you to create something in the world. And that had a lot of parallels to me wanting to use gene editing to create something in the world, right? It's the same idea. These people want something to exist. They help to fund it. So we got onto WeFunder, and obviously it was a pretty dramatic success for us. It gave us the life that we needed to get some grants to come in. We got $400,000 in grant funding, basically during the 6-month period that our first WeFunder was open, being able to have a whole cycle of submissions, reviews, and then, grant awards. So that was huge. And then obviously we turned around and raised $468,000 on the platform in that 6 months. So huge success.
Yeah, I love stories like that. So we're seeing more and more companies now that the opposite, like they don't need the money. They can easily raise from VCs. Maybe they're further along. Like Mercury is a good example. Raised a 120 million Series B, and then basically just opened up $5 million, not for the capital, but just for the marketing and kind of customer engagement stuff. But yeah, like a big part of why I work at WeFunder is, for folks that might be kind of seen as too early or too risky. But if they can, as you say, raise money from people that believe in what they're doing, really want you to succeed, you can raise that initial seed capital to then get to a point where you can raise the grants and then de-risk it for institutional investors, which is, I'm sure, kind of where you are now. And so it's almost like, this is why Nick and Greg and Mike founded WeFunder, is like to basically enable more founders to take their shot, more ideas to kind of get out there into the world. It's really, really inspiring. And you said perfect platform. Thank you. Why was it perfect? And kind of who were your investors?
I think just dog lovers, honestly. So Facebook advertising was a little bit different back then, in 2019 into 2020, of course. But we saw really great Facebook return on investment, like 8x through our campaign, which was awesome. And so I think it was just targeting dog owners and biotech enthusiasts really is what drove us, kind of creating that buzz. And so I
mean, I saw so many comments of, investors on your campaign. And it's like, why did you invest? It's like, my dog died of cancer, or I'm just like, so you could tell.
Or
like,
hoping, my dog died, but, I'm hoping that the next dog could live, had a ton of those. And so that's, really inspiring. And also, one of the reasons, one of the things I always hear from VCs, even today, is, what's the market? Like who actually pays for a $5,000 treatment or $10,000 treatment for their dog? And so, that was another thing that WeFunder, demonstrates, right? We have over 1,000 shareholders now, who are obviously the people who would pay significantly for their dogs to have a better chance at life.
Yeah, amazing. Any downsides? What are the kind of cons of raising capital on WeFunder, especially kind of for a biotech founder?
Yeah, so I think I'm in the Midwest, and so I think everything is slower to get here. There's still investors who won't invest on a safe here in the
You were
Midwest.
raising on a safe, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Which I mean,
yeah.
it's
But
like Y Combinator standard, right?
well, right, and I mean even outside of WeFunder, let's put WeFunder to the side. Like there's still investors who won't invest on a safe
Right.
around me, and
Yeah.
so the fact that if they won't invest in a safe, then you could assume that they think equity crowdfunding is weird, to say the least, right?
Yeah.
And so, there has been a little bit of that, some pushback when I'm talking to people. It's like, oh, you raised equity crowdfunding, and then now I can explain to them, why it was fine, right? Especially with the recent changes on March 15th this year,
Mhm.
with the SPV structures and everything like that. It's really no different than raising on AngelList or just raising a group round from an angel group, right?
Mhm.
So I think that any of the cons are certainly, you can push
Surmountable.
back on. Yeah, certainly surmountable these days. As far as being a biotech company raising on WeFunder, I think there's pros and cons there too, right? So a pro could be, or absolutely is, you have a really technical thing that's pretty early, kind of like you touched on earlier. And if you get people behind this really cool, maybe science fiction idea,
Mm.
you can reprogram cells and make them fight cancer. You can do this for dogs, like that's kind
Yeah.
of science fiction, even still. And so to get those people who are future thinkers, behind you, I think is a huge pro that you can get that. I mean, just look at Adam Limbs, for that. Certainly a futuristic technology
Yeah,
that's
you've
doing
been following
amazingly
that
well.
campaign as well.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, really
So
cool.
yeah, I talked to them before they launched the first WeFunder.
Tyler.
Yeah, I talked to Tyler trying to help him out on how to raise, and it's just like,
Well,
well,
you did a good job, man,
clearly,
because he's
yeah.
he's
Well,
going
no,
great
he
guns.
needs he needs to come back and help us for our next one. We're not quite to the 2 million mark there yet, but
Yeah.
anyway, yeah. So, and a con for a biotech company though could be the fact that it's just not tangible, right?
Mhm.
A software product on WeFunder, you could raise pretty quickly because it's someone who maybe you use the software, or
Mhm.
you can go to the app store and actually see that app.
Right.
Or the Adam limb, right? They have actual videos of someone with this
Yeah.
limb.
I mean, in a
And,
sense, though, it's not tangible in a sense that you can't. The cell therapy is like kind of an abstract kind of concept. You can't see the cell therapy, but I mean, in a sense, like there's nothing really more tangible than like your tagline was probably my favorite tagline in the history of companies on WeFunder, and I've seen at this stage over 1,000 of them. Curing cancer in dogs. 4 words. Like, I don't think there's a better kind of emotive, like, kind of attention grabbing, like, and kind of in a sense tangible
yeah,
story. I just thought that was like just brilliant. I don't know who came up with that. Was it you?
that's a YC thing. That's a
Okay.
YC thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just be as short and succinct and to the point as possible. That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
For
I've
sure.
learned
So
that. I've learned that from Nick, who he probably already had it before going through YC, but that's
yeah.
probably kind of reinforced by the YC feedback and experience for sure. Well, I mean, one kind of potential downside I think for biotech founders could be, if you're a consumer facing, I guess you could say this is the same for B2B enterprise SaaS. If you're consumer facing, I think that is really the absolute sweet spot for WeFunder, because you probably, if you have like tens of thousands of consumers that are using the product, you can go to those people and ask them to invest. You didn't have customers of LEAH
Yep.
Labs, right, in kind of 2019. So you didn't have that audience. So how did you kind of overcome that? I mean, you mentioned Facebook ads as one strategy. I'm sure that was kind of not a huge proportion or percentage of the investment volume. What were the other kind of things that you did to recruit investors and raise the money?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook ads was huge, but always trying to get on a new podcast. Always just trying to do that groundwork to talk to new people. I mean, posting a lot on Facebook, posting a lot on Twitter and Instagram, and just trying to build a following. Things like that. There's all these different agencies now who want to help with equity crowdfunding. So one of them, I think, was a huge benefit to us was the Boardroom. that ended up having its own
Yeah.
issues, I think. But
Yeah.
when we went live on the boardroom, then over the next week we raised like
Yeah.
140,000, which was like well over a quarter of our raise.
Right.
So that was a huge percentage and a huge help. So if there's someone building that in the legal way,
finding those groups of investors who are looking for opportunities and pitches to look at. Yeah,
but like our second raise, so this is just our first. The second raise when we came back this year, I just want to go to the point of like the first time it was out of necessity to use WeFunder to find people who believed in this. The second time we actively chose it because we knew that we could jumpstart our seed round through these backers. We even got angel investors who have never invested on WeFunder, who had invested in LEAH, like post demo day or whatever, went on to WeFunder because I asked them to invest a significant check, 25K check, a 50K check, and so that was really cool. And that obviously helped to jumpstart. And when we launched live on WeFunder the second time, we had 200K live.
Nice.
When we opened to the public, and I think 80K of that matched back to previous WeFunder investors themselves, let alone the other angels that came in. So that was huge.
You said kickstart your seed round. How did you kind of? I'm always kind of curious about different stories of founders doing this, because you have some folks like, from Mercury, it's like raise the Series B and then bolt on the WeFunder community round at the end of it, right? And then you have people that's like the other way, where it's like, okay, maybe kind of how do we build momentum on the round? Okay, let's start with like hundreds of investors on WeFunder, and then kind of roll that into, raising capital from wherever, angels and VCs. We've had founders like connect to VCs as a direct result of them being on WeFunder, and that's like how the VC finds them. So for your seed round, how did the WeFunder raise kind of integrate with other capital that you were raising?
Yeah, so we initially set out to use the WeFunder, I guess, like you said, as the kickstart. So we had always, been kind of having conversations with the VCs, hoping that we would, raise a $2 or $3 million sort of seed round in March, or start, kick off in March this year. And it seemed that the sentiment was not quite as strong as we had hoped to get that full like 2 or 3 million from VC. They were still kind of hoping to see some efficacy data, which was really the main focus of the seed round, but they were wanting to have it be further de-risked, right? And so we realized that it was going to be sort of an angel round, and there was a number of angel groups to talk to, especially in the Midwest, Tech Coast Angels and everything out in California as well. Which we ended up having some investors join us from, because we were able to raise on WeFunder. So yeah, we viewed WeFunder as a way that we were hoping to close out, a quick 500K. We had originally reserved it to be, 25% of our round. Was WeFunder was going to be the lead, if you will, to start us off. Then find a VC to come in for 1.5 or 2 on top of that. And it ended up sort of not happening that way, which just ended up being sort of an angel round again. But the 400K that we raised the second time on WeFunder in just, 2.5 months was huge for us.
So it became kind of a bridge round then.
Yeah.
And exactly. then kind of allowed you to continue to get that efficacy data, so that now in 2022, you can go back to VCs to
well, and it gave us more life. Here we are, another grant. The breaking news here, we got another grant and everything. So I mean, it's huge to be able to raise the capital in this way.
Love it. What's next for LEAH?
Well, this pilot study really is my biggest headache and excitement at the same time for LEAH. Making sure that we get this product, this FVP, if you will, into some patients this year. So we're how
many patients in the trial? How long is the trial?
Yeah, so we're looking to organize maybe a 3 or 4 center trial, and looking to enroll 12 to 16 dogs over just a handful of months. Maybe 2 or 3 months would be the goal. That's why I'm opening it up to like 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 different academic groups.
Is it easy for you to find centers? Or like, I would imagine that centers are like, yes, please pick us to be one of the 4 that you.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, I haven't talked to anyone who wants to, or who is an oncologist who is like, oh no, I wouldn't work on that. Some of them have to say that because they don't have the time in their practice to be able to run a clinical trial, like private practices versus academics, that kind of thing.
Right.
But everyone sees CAR T cells in humans, and I think it's a consensus now. And I hope that LEAH Labs has been part of that, being around for 3 years now, that this type of therapy is coming to dogs. And so here we are going to be the first to launch, a multi-center trial for CAR T cells in dogs. So that's really the main focus, launching next year. We need to get this phase 2 SBIR in for our platform, help us scale and think about manufacturing. So that's what a phase 2 grant is for actually, more commercialization type focus. So working on that. And then this phase 1 that we're, looking like we're getting here from the NIH, that's actually for an entirely different program outside of oncology. That's more to build a model for autoimmune diseases in dogs. Just like humans get autoimmune diseases, so do dogs. They're really good models for it. And so that's, a whole nother thing now that instead of oncology that I need to start thinking about. And really starting to build those pharma connections and people who might be interested in working with us to model autoimmune diseases, because that's more of a licensing play rather than something that we may look to commercialize. Dogs do get autoimmune diseases. There's probably some people who would pay for it, but as far as a venture backable market, if you will, that might not exist. So we're looking for really starting to build out this, what we call this discovery engine model, where we're looking to partner with human pharma companies to trial novel therapies in dogs that will eventually go to humans someday.
That's another interesting kind of analogy versus software startups. We have like the MVP versus the FVP. We have like the KPIs and the metrics and the YC growth sprint, and that's different. Like, kind of the Peter Thiel, like 0 to 1 book, right? Like focus on a kind of target market, or I've been reading Crossing the Chasm, kind of like focus on one niche. How do you know that, expanding your focus to autoimmune diseases is the right thing to do at this stage versus kind of, continuing to stay focused on oncology?
Yeah, so we view this kind of in 2 different buckets, right? There's our dilutive funding, like our investor money. That stuff is definitely staying focused on oncology.
Right.
We're looking to build out a pipeline. If you go to any biotech company's website, they have a pipeline chart that shows their different programs, their different therapies that are moving along. So, as a company, using the investor money, we have raised money to be a dog cancer company because we know that there's a market there. We may need to be the ones that fully create it or enable it, but we think that cell therapies and CAR T is going to be what creates this new market for dogs that's really never existed before. But the grants that we write, grant funding is where you get to kind of have fun and kind of get to play with different ideas. And so that all goes into sort of like a separate bucket. And certainly there's overlap. So, in these grants, even with the NSF grant and the NIH grant, those are for like the gene editing platform for helping to develop that to get some novel IP around that. But then has to be an application in medicine, of course, especially for the NIH. And so that's where we chose autoimmune diseases as a potential model. And so, another grant that we're thinking about, or other things that we're thinking about, is doggy dementia. And dogs, really old dogs like poodles, people will diagnose their pets with what they believe is to be dementia. They'll forget where their dog bowl, where their food is. They'll forget to go outside. Those sorts of things are really analogous to dementia in humans. And so there's this growing consensus that dogs could be a good model for that as well. So we're also considering grants towards that front. And any number of other diseases, including inflammatory bowel diseases and things like that. A lot of fun to be had. And for the time being, a lot of that would fall in that grant bucket.
That's really, really cool, man. From the very first conversation with you, I've just been super inspired by what you're doing. This is exactly the kind of, company that I think all of us on the WeFunder team work here to support and, kind of be a very, very small part of kind of the journey. I think it's why investors, as you saw from the many, many notes of investors kind of talking about why they're excited to invest in you, same thing. This is what WeFunder is all about. I am kind of, very kind of legally compliance kind of constrained from having favorites on WeFunder, but to the extent that I'm allowed by FINRA, you are one of my favorites for sure, Wes. Okay, last question. We ask this to every founder on the podcast. One piece of advice, maybe for an early stage biotech founder, someone that's just graduating from their PhD program or just on the early steps of starting their biotech company. One piece of advice.
Ooh, put me on the spot. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and it's kind of stupid to say, and it's gonna sound really dumb to say out loud, but don't die, right? Like just if you can stay alive long enough, something is gonna work out for the company, right? And I think that this is certainly true in like software, maybe more easily true in software. Obviously don't run out of money, don't die. This is not like crazy advice, but I really think that the going gets super hard and it's really challenging, and you look at the runway and what you might need to get done, but then a grant comes in because you've prepared for that, right? And this is our grant that just came in. Really excites me about where we're going to be able to go. And so just always grinding to make sure that there's an iron in that fire, that at some point it's going to hit, so that you just don't die, because if you don't die at some point, you're going to make it. So, we in our network, in our backyard, there's a company that was founded in like 2008, and they've been slowly moving along, slowly fundraising, slowly growing their team, very heavily grant funded. Yeah. And as a biotech company, they just refuse to die. And now they're finally getting to the point where they have some subsidiaries that are going to, potentially IPO and get products to market. And so, just doing whatever you can to stay alive sounds dumb, but that's really the advice that I give. Just those irons in the fire to stay alive.
Love that, man. Certainly resonates on the WeFunder team. We launched WeFunder in 2012. Not me. I joined in early 2018, but there've been many bumps in the road, ups and downs, and having that resilience and tenacity to see it through when they go and get stuff. And on the biotech side, you're kind of learning lessons all the time, doing research, learning more lessons on the science, on the WeFunder side, right? Learning more lessons about kind of the product and the market and finding that product market fit. And then maybe, the macro economy turns and money is more available, right? Or maybe, kind of some new technological breakthrough comes along, or in 2017, the kind of FDA approval comes along. For us, as you mentioned earlier, the rule changes from March 15th of this year, allowing companies to raise 5 million SPVs. Like now, since then, it's like hockey stick, but we could, Nick and, Greg could easily have packed it in like, a few years ago. There's some Paul Graham quote that I can't remember. It's something along the lines of, I think it's PG, like the only reason why a startup fails is that the founder decides to shut it down. It's kind of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a much more intelligent way for me to have referenced this "don't die" point. But yeah, I mean, that's really what I think about every day, is just stay alive.
Well, that's an awesome note to end on. Wes, It's been a pleasure working with you on 2 campaigns. Hopefully we might do another one in the future. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jonny.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Adventure Capital. I hope you laughed, took notes, shed a tear, and most importantly, feel ready to go off on your own adventure. And remember, whenever you're ready, WeFunder's here to help. Be sure to like and leave a review, gang.